This is an ACU Centre for Liturgy podcast. Speaking of liturgy. On the night before he died, Jesus prayed that all may be one. Speaking of liturgy, the Reverend Robert Gribben, Emeritus Professor of Worship and Mission at the former United Faculty of Theology in Melbourne, Australia, and Director of Ecumenical Relationships for the World Methodist Council, reflects on Christian unity and the hopes and challenges associated with the ecumenical movement with Dr. Paul Taylor.
Very good morning again, Robert, and welcome to our ACU Centre for Liturgy podcast recording. It's a great delight to be with you again. Robert, you have worked and moved in ecumenical circles for much of your life. How would you describe the connection between the ecumenical and liturgical movements?
If you want to know what a particular Christian tradition believes and teaches, the best place to discover it is at worship, in the practical experience of a liturgy. In my boyhood, the idea of visiting another church on Sunday was virtually unknown and not encouraged. So, of course, at 14, I did. I went to the local Catholic church, and I realised that there were many ways of worshipping the same God. So I accidentally found myself in the ecumenical liturgical movement. I learned a very great deal about other churches and was driven back to discover what it was that my own Methodist church believed. Those who worked in foreign missions discovered that our different theologies and practice were exported to mission lands where they did not necessarily make sense. The World Council of Churches traces its origins to a worldwide conference of missionaries in 1910 in Edinburgh. And Jesus, in his high priestly prayer, prayed that his followers be one, and added, that the world might believe. Now, in the external human perspective, the church was never one. Even Peter and Paul fell out. But there is a deeper, mysterious unity which reflects the unity of God the Holy Trinity, which allows for variety and particular genius, but does not build walls. That disunity threatened the effective proclamation of the gospel to those who didn't know it. So it's no surprise that one outcome was the first new united church of our time, the Church of South India, and it came out of that missionary experience. 4 churches of Western origin, Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian, Congregational, entered into dialogue and agreed to form a new church for the Indian cultural context. And they chose episcopacy as the form of government. 3 of them had never had bishops, but they accepted it as a link with the universal church and as a symbol of unity. And others have followed. There's some 25 united churches of different kinds by this day. And there have been challenges on the way, and in my view, sadly, the Uniting Church in Australia in 1977 decided against adopting an episcopal system.
How influential was the Second Vatican Council on ecumenism?
One of the convictions of the churches of the 16th century Reformation was that as an imperfect earthly body, the church needed always to be reformed. So this is not a new idea, and some of the finer times in church history, real efforts have been made at reform and renewal in the church's life. And in our own time, the outstanding one was the Second Vatican Council. And actually, I can't think of a church in the world which was not touched by it. Pope John XXIII's vision was wide and deep, and the agenda the bishops were working on was not only of internal Catholic concern. And Rome showed itself very ready to share its treasures. we have all benefited and we have all changed, thanks be to God.
Mhm.
And this ecumenical sharing has gone on. 2 of my Cambridge tutors were ecumenical observers at the council. My supervisor in liturgy continued as a consultant, and his study floor was covered with manuscripts in Latin, the first drafts of the Mass of Pope Paul VI. And in the meantime, several other churches, like the Anglican and the Lutheran, as well as my own Uniting, were preparing their own new liturgical books. And in the Australian consultation on liturgy, which included the Catholics and an Orthodox and half a dozen other churches, all shared the work they were doing so far and went back with fresh ideas. The English language liturgical consultation internationally had full membership of the national groups and of the Vatican's International Consultation on English Texts, ICET. And we found ourselves debating the best common form of English for worldwide use, chiefly, of course, between English and American English. The report published in 1988, called Prayers We Have in Common, was adopted in almost all the new liturgical books. Unfortunately, we couldn't convince the Vatican to adopt the modern form of the Our Father. And then with the 2001 instruction Liturgiam Authenticam, which tied Catholic translations to the Latin, our work ground to a halt. But most of those liturgies are several decades old now, and we all need to work on their texts, I think, together again, because very few of us can do it alone. But something more is needed. The churches are much more open to each other now, and we cooperate in very important ways, and there are important things still to do. It's still not possible, regrettably, for a devout Anglican to receive communion at a Catholic Mass. Yes, there are certain circumstances in which it's possible. Nor can a loyal Catholic receive the bread of life from my hands. In many cases, baptism is mutually recognised, but many folk in the pews have no idea of what has happened between us in the last decades or why. They need to know.
Robert, what role have the international theological dialogues played?
The Second Vatican Council launched the notion of bilateral theological dialogue, where representatives of another church sit down with those from the Vatican and they address the theological and the other issues which have divided us. Some matters were fairly easily resolved, and so we're left now with complex questions which have no simple answers. So we continue to meet. One recent idea is called receptive ecumenism, whereby instead of setting out what your church believes and teaches, your church asks its partner, what gifts have you received which we lack or have lost, and by which we might be blessed? I note that ARCIC 3, the International Anglican and Vatican Dialogue, has adopted this principle. It's sad, really, that the results of these conversations rarely are heard by normal congregations. We need people with the gift of being able to make complex issues clear without watering them down.
Yes, indeed. Where does the Pentecostal movement fit in with ecumenism?
Well, there are new players in the ecumenical movement. Churches which have come from non-British cultures and didn't exist a century ago. I'm thinking of Spanish in particular. The Catholic Church was wise enough to embrace the Pentecostal movement when it re-emerged at the start of the 20th century, so that there is now a strong, charismatic Catholic Church. Many other churches were defensive and dismissive and are still divided by it. But Pentecostals and others are also discovering the other churches.
Yes, yes.
And if we take a brief look at statistics, we discover that the combined number of Pentecostals and different evangelical churches, plus the entirely new churches that have grown up this century, is now very close to the numbers of the Catholic Church, combining its Eastern and Western families, making about 1.5 billion members. So who's a mainstream church?
Yes.
Historic Protestantism has to recognise this too. Actually, there are more separate churches today than there were when the ecumenical movement arose, and the number's still growing.
Amazing. What part did the World Council of Churches play?
The World Council has been the major player in the ecumenical movement outside Rome, and there is a very strong working relationship with the Roman Catholic Church. The Council's work in bringing the churches together through its various commissions has been very fruitful. They include, you must remember, the Orthodox churches, which is important and draws them into constant conversation. There are now some 356 member churches of the World Council, but few from the ranks of the new churches were applying for membership. For many, ecumenism was a dirty word because they thought it involved seeking unity at the cost of truth, or because they were suspicious of some of the bigger churches. A widely representative group of theologians and leaders of the old and the new churches was formed, which proposed a different kind of meeting, a forum where all would be safe, all would be heard, outside the established councils, and not yet another institution. The result was the Global Christian Forum, and I was at its first global gathering in Limuru in Kenya in 2001. And by the way, that was probably the most widely representative gathering of Christians in church history.
Gosh.
It
Amazing.
still flourishes elsewhere in the world, but is probably least known in our Australia-Pacific region. It need not be so. The Forum's General Secretary visited Australia earlier this year. Let's hope that has started a conversation.
Yes, indeed. How would you describe the ecumenical movement at the present?
I think the word would be becalmed. Stopped in its tracks by the challenge of an increasingly secular world culture, undermined by its own institutional moral lapses, collapsing under its own bureaucratic weight, and immobilised by the high likelihood that the churches as we have known them are disappearing from the face of the earth. But the Spirit breaks through even in the midst of our failures and raises up apostles, prophets and teachers in this generation. We just need to remember whose church this is.
Yes, exactly. What would you like to occur as we look to the future of ecumenism?
Well, yes, what about the immediate future? Well, first of all, we need to assess what effect the COVID pandemic had on all our churches. Together, we are the body of Christ, but we were all forced to isolate from each other and to do all those things which made us safe places, but separate. We used the communication tools available to us, often uncritically, and were tempted, I believe, to mistake the virtual for the real. The defining manifestation of the Christian church is the assembly of baptized people together with those whose gifts of the Spirit are recognized through leadership. Human communication is by the senses, all of them, sight, touch, taste, hearing and smell, not by remote transmitted media. Pope Leo recently warned young people about dependence on social media. The danger, he said, is that a faith discovered online is limited to individual experiences, which may be intellectually and emotionally reassuring, but never embodied. He went on, such experiences remain disembodied, detached from the ecclesial body. Whole congregations need to consider to what extent they are now in that danger. Well, change is already here, and some of the next generation is already in church. They're not only the future. Together, we need to find our way through the jungle of challenges in social and religious and intellectual, generational and cultural spheres. The issues belong to all the age groups, and the answers will not only come from the future or the young. The faith will be handed on by all of us together. The image and symbol of the body is fundamental to Christians in everything we do. Let's not divide it any longer, any further. Let's rediscover the gift of unity in Christ.
What a wonderful note to finish on, Robert. Thank you so much for your generous insights into the ecumenical movement and also your wonderful reflections on your rich life experience working ecumenically here in Australia, but also internationally. You're a living treasure for the churches, and we are very grateful to you. Thank you very much.
I've been greatly blessed.
That was the Reverend Robert Gribben, reflecting on Christian unity and the hopes and challenges of the ecumenical movement with Dr. Paul Taylor. The ACU Centre for Liturgy, which provides pastoral formation in liturgy across Australia and beyond, is pleased to provide this podcast, Speaking of Liturgy.